Good afternoon, everybody. Distinguished speaker, Professor Ormond Simpson, Visiting Fellow, London University International Program, Vice Chancellor, Professor Anbahan Ariyudare, Deputy Vice Chancellor, Professor Gunaherath, professors, deans of faculties, directors, fellow academic colleagues, non-academic colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Professor Rajendra, Director of International Relations Unit at the Open University of Sri Lanka. On behalf of the Open University of Sri Lanka, I would like to express my sincere thanks to our distinguished speaker, Professor Ormond Simpson, for accepting our invitation. Also, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to this second lecture of the third distinguished lecture series, which is organized by the IRU collaboration with the Center for Educational Technology and Media and IT Department of the Open University of Sri Lanka. In line with the government of Sri Lanka's initiatives in strengthening the education sector of the country through the international collaboration, the Open University of Sri Lanka continuously engaging in establishing collaborative relationship to increase its international standing, builds its global profile, increase the organization of its academic offerings, and conduct high impact research. And OUSL Distinguished Lecture Series, which is designed to foster rich academic discourse among local and international academics. The lecture series further intended to build capacity among Sri Lankan academics in good academic practices, technology assisted teaching, sound research methodologies, and high impact publications. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Ormond Simpson. Professor Ormond Simpson has more than 40 years of experience in student retention and learner support in open and distance learning. He currently a visiting fellow at London University International Programs. Prior to that, he worked at Open University Polytechnic of New Zealand as visiting professor and at the UK Open University as senior lecturer in international research. He has run training workshops and seminars in Spain, Mexico, Holland, Brazil, South Africa, Ghana, China, the West Indies, Colombia, South Korea, the Gambia and Papua Guinea also. His distance education interests are in student support and retention, cost benefits, ethical issues, learning motivation, e-learning, and staff development. He has written 3 books, the latest being the Supporting Students for Success in Online and Distance Education, as well as 10 book chapters and more than 30 journal articles. With this short introduction, I would like to call Professor Ormond Simpson to deliver his lecture.
Thank you very much indeed, colleagues, for inviting me here today. It's a real pleasure to be with you. I'm something of a kind of student support and retention nut. I like nothing better than to go to places, interesting places, talk to interesting and delightful people about the whole issue of student retention, student support, and student dropout. So it is a particular pleasure to be with you today. I was wondering how to choose a topic for this lecture, and I was thinking back to my very young days. I was dispatched as a child to the kind of school where you were thrust, whether you liked it or not, into the Army Cadet Corps. I was possibly the world's worst Army cadet, and I remember being taken down to the firing range with a colleague, and we were both sitting there or standing there firing at these targets. We both fired off 10 rounds each, at these paper targets, and my target was pulled back and it was completely unmarked, not a mark on it anywhere. My friend's target was pulled back and he had 16 bullet holes in his, and he'd only fired 10. So I only assumed that I'd been firing at the wrong target. Rather the story of my life, but it does remind me all the time that when you're thinking about things, you need to be sure that you're firing at the right target. The other lesson I learned from the Army cadets was when we were given lectures on tactics and strategy. I don't remember anything about them except just one thing that our old Sergeant Major used to say again and again, and that was, time spent in reconnaissance is never wasted. And I thought, well, gosh, yes. The little children in this presentation here will be growing up in a rather different world, and certainly, possibly, a rather different distance education world. And perhaps we owe it to them maybe to try and undertake a little reconnaissance of what sorts of futures might be available to them in distance education. So I looked at possibilities, and of course when we think of futures we generally think of technological futures, but actually there are many other futures as well. There's the social, ethical, psychological, financial and political futures. So I thought, let's have a little browse through these and see what we might find. So I thought we'd start with technological futures because, well, there's a lot of that around. I'm sure that you've come across many of these. The MOOCs, the massive online open courses, are very, very fashionable all round, and everyone wants to do a MOOC. But there are many others as well, the virtual reality, artificial intelligence, and so on. So let me look at these in turn. MOOCs. Well, millions and millions of people are enrolled in these massive online open courses. And the Open University itself has certainly put a great deal of money into its MOOC, its Future Learn, and there's a lot of topics on there and many fascinating topics as well. And students can just enroll in these and they can choose whatever they want to study for free, or at least for free at the moment. But things aren't that straightforward. The completion rates of MOOCs are often 7% or less. Some people say that doesn't matter, they're free and you shouldn't be worried about low completion rates. More worrying is the fact that they really are only appealing to the already well qualified. More than 80% of participants on a MOOC have degrees already. So they're using them to retrain or follow up an interest. They are not reaching those students who we think might really benefit from them. And of course, there is another problem, which is that no one has yet found a way of making any money out of them. I think it's Professor David Noble in America who refers to MOOCs as technological tapeworms in the guts of higher education. Well, I don't know about a tapeworm, but it's certainly costing the Open University in the UK a great deal of money, and there's really no sign yet that they're going to be able to get any of them back. I'd like to say to them, maybe you should concentrate on the paying customers, but this is not a popular message yet. Another technological future, and one that I think may be more promising, is the area of virtual reality. I expect you've come across this. This is where you can wear a rather bulky headset that will give you an environment that feels like a real environment. You can turn and see different bits of the environment. You can interact with the environment. You could, for instance, be in a virtual classroom, listening to a virtual lecture, looking at the virtual students. They may well be some sort of future. At the moment, virtual reality sets are extremely expensive. They need a very high quality of broadband. And I noticed that some people who've tried virtual reality finds that the technology can actually distract from the experience of learning. That shouldn't surprise us, I suppose. It's not unusual for technology to get in the way of learning. We have experience of that in other fields. A more interesting approach, and one which I think may well appear in distance education at some point in the future, is the whole area of artificial intelligence. This is, in effect, where you use a robot to answer student questions. A student can type, or indeed even speak to the robot, who will be programmed to answer, well, hopefully, most of the questions that students will ask. Once a robot is up and running, it's really quite inexpensive to run, and students seem to like it. There's certainly one course in the US on artificial intelligence, of course, where they introduced an artificial intelligent student advisor, and they ran it for a year, and many students were actually unaware that they were talking to a robot when they were asking questions. They seemed actually quite to like it. And I'm reminded of quite a few years ago when people were experimenting with counselling programs, where you could type in your question and there was a program which would reply to you with something approaching some sort of human interaction. And there's a story that the man who'd written one of these programs left it running on his computer, and when he came back, his secretary was busy at the computer typing in, and she asked him to leave the room because what she was typing and what she was getting back were very sensitive issues, and she was really involved in it. And we know, don't we, that people apparently do become friends with their artificial intelligence systems. But it's very expensive to set up, and it's still very experimental. I'm not sure that we are going to see this in the near future, but people are beginning to talk about it. There's an article in the Times Higher Education recently that says the journey towards a virtual tutor that can help lecturers to do their job appears to have taken a significant step forward with Pearson's announcement that it will use IBM's Watson computer system as a teaching assistant on its learning resources. I thought this was quite worrying, but fortunately the following week there was an article that listed all the jobs that might be replaced by artificial intelligence, and I was relieved to see that the job of higher education teacher was one of the least likely to be wholly replaced by artificial intelligence. So that may come in, but I don't think it's going to come very fast. Something else that I think is much more likely, and indeed is already practical and already happening, is the field of learning analytics. This is where universities can use student data to monitor student learning so that tutors can intervene. These data analysis systems are already available, and this is a picture of one of the systems that's being used in the OU. This actually shows what a student is doing. You can see that on the bottom of that graph it shows how active they are being at any particular time, and at the top of the graph it shows how many modules they've completed and so on. That's for an individual student, and there are systems for looking at students overall. So for instance, this is for another individual student showing her activity, showing what she's completed, and at the bottom left there, comparing her with what other students have done. I've taken these screenshots directly from an article called A Data Wrangler Perspective, so they're not particularly clear. But this shows the progress of a group of students, how much they've done, where they've got to, and at the end, what their predicted probability of passing their course is. That's okay if you've got all your students online, of course. That's a sine qua non. It's not going to help us here very much while students are still somewhat offline much of the time. We will see. I think that learning analytics does have some potential. In the OU, we've already used it in terms of a predictive model to do research and to focus our resources on the students who are most vulnerable. So we've been able to produce a list of students and their predicted probability of success, and we can focus our interventions on the students who we think are most likely to drop out. There's still issues here, though. There's issues, for instance, of privacy. Just how much data should we have about students? Well, that's something that still needs to be looked at. Another, and I suppose already existing, system is the use of social software. You already know that students are using social software and that some universities are certainly using social software to link students up. One of the problems, of course, is that there's many different systems, and this is just a short list of the ones that you can find as you ramble around the internet. There's problems with them, of course. I noticed, for instance, that one system there, Yik Yak, has actually been withdrawn by its makers recently because it was filling up with harassment and worse, and was likely to lead to some court cases and so on. So one of the problems is, if you want to get into social software, which one of these do you choose? There's not a lot of evidence that I'm aware that they're effective in terms of retention and student support, and certainly there are privacy issues about abuse. And what's more, I was talking to a student the other day who said he really didn't like his university being on Facebook. It felt like having lectures in the student bar. So I think we've still a lot to learn about social software, and I still find I'm using the telephone rather a lot to contact students. Something else that I'm sure is coming in is the whole area of podcasts and the so-called flipped classroom. Podcasts, of course, well, indeed, this itself is a podcast. We can record it, put it on the internet, and it's available for anyone to read at any time. They are being used in distance education quite widely, putting material online for students to look at and subsequently discuss. One place that's very good at this is the European Association of Distance Teaching Universities, who are have something called an Empower project. And you'll find on the Empower website a large number of podcasts, some of them by myself, I'm afraid, about a whole range of topics in distance education. I mentioned the flipped classroom. This is something where conventional universities are, at last, catching up with distance universities. We've been doing flipped classrooms for years. What it means is that conventional universities have now realized that you can ask students to watch a podcast or a video before the class, and then the class is used for exercises, projects, and discussions. We've been doing this for years, colleagues, so I don't think this really counts as a technological future. And it's interesting that conventional universities are at last catching up with some of the things that we've been doing for a long time. Another thing in the technological futures group, of course, is mobile learning. Students using mobile devices for learning wherever they are. Smartphones, although I'm not too clear that you can read a great deal on a smartphone without getting very tired. Tablets, of course, are rather more. And there are apps that you can run on a smartphone or a tablet which don't need an internet connection and from which you can learn. My youngest daughter sent me the Duolingo app with a stern message that it was about time I learnt another language. So I've downloaded it onto my phone, and I haven't yet learnt another language. Maybe one of these days I'll get round to it. Ebooks, of course, are now around a long time, quite inexpensive, not yet very interactive, but they may be coming. I actually find ebooks quite difficult to read. I much prefer an ordinary book on paper, and there is indeed quite a lot of evidence that student comprehension is better looking at paper than it is looking at a screen. So I hope the University of Sri Lanka will not switch everything to being online. I hope you'll keep your paper copies. Despite the expense and the problems of getting them to students, I think they are going to stay more useful for learning than any amount of screens. One other technological innovation that I rather like the look of is using games. At a conference a couple of months ago, I met a woman who is running what is called the Serious Games Institute, and she's developing games for teaching people. In particular, she had a game for health promotion. Apparently, there is a problem with young people who have cancer. They tend to forget to take their drugs. Indeed, I think it's probably rather more than tending to forget. They actively really don't want to take these drugs, which of course make them feel awful, but are saving their lives. So what she did was invent a game in which taking the drugs becomes part of a game, where you shoot your drugs at your body, virtual body, and you can see the effect they're having on you, and that encourages you to take your drug. I've not seen a lot of evidence yet for games in distance education, but I rather like the look of them, I must say. I've used games in staff development for distance teachers, and they seem to work well. The element of humour in them often hides the seriousness of what people are learning. So I rather expect we'll see more games coming into distance education in the future. Something else that I'm sure will be coming in as internet access grows is the whole issue of assessment and feedback. The idea that you can do something on your laptop or tablet and get almost instant feedback, I think is really quite important. And as I say, it goes very well with Professor Hattie's insistence that one of the most useful ways of helping students learn is to give them the opportunity to know how well they're doing. So I shall be looking forward to seeing assessment and feedback coming in online more and more in the future. But of course, as so often with internet developments, there's a downside. Plagiarism is now a massive problem, not just in distance education, but in conventional education too. This is not just copying material offline, but actually buying assignments written by someone else. Certainly in the UK, there's a number of these. I found Essay Writing Service UK. I could go into that website and ask for an essay on a particular topic. That I would get that in a matter of a few days, and they would guarantee at least a B grade. Really quite problematic. And it's not surprising that the European Union are working on a substantial system, the Tesla e-assessment project, to try and spot both plagiarism and bought material. There are some developments which I rather hope won't happen. This is one that I'm very suspicious of, the emotional detection systems. This is the idea where you can put a webcam on a student's computer which will look at their facial expressions and detect what the student is feeling. There's actually a system for sale already, Tutor, and I believe the UK Open University is also working on a system. Quite what happens if a webcam detects that a student is looking bored, angry, or indeed has fallen asleep at their computer, I suppose the idea is that a robot tutor will send a message to that student, getting them to wake up, or in my imagination, a small electric shock through their keyboard. No, I'm sure that won't happen. But there are huge difficulties with this. There's not a lot of evidence in any projects I've seen, and there are real ethical and privacy issues. A few years ago, a college in Philadelphia gave all its students laptops. Wonderful, what a resource. They neglected to tell students that they were controlling the webcams remotely. You can imagine what might happen, and what did happen, when the news got out quite quickly. There was an absolute storm of protest, and of course, being America, law cases were taken and money was spent and the damage was enormous. So there are ethical and privacy issues in this, and on the whole, I really wish it won't happen. Those are the sorts of technological futures that are possibly happening, but there are many others. And I can only cover a few that I think are most likely. But there are other kinds of futures as well. There's the social futures. There's a question of how far distance education will reach. When the Professor John Daniels was Vice-Chancellor of the Open University a number of years ago, he suggested the Coca-Cola process. He said you would need two ways of presenting the university, the Open University Online and the Open University Classic, because only in that way would you actually reach the maximum number of students. This hasn't happened. What's happened is that apparently they've taken the two tins and mixed them up, and we now have a sort of Open University mixed. I'm not sure how effective this is. The issue, of course, here is that in Sri Lanka there is still some way to go on access to the internet. I'm taking access at home as a measure, but of course students have access elsewhere. But even so, until you get a level of access that is much higher than this, I suspect that you would prefer to use the Open University Sri Lanka Classic rather than online. But having said that, of course, we know that mobile phone ownership in Sri Lanka is actually rather more than 100%. Smartphone ownership must be less. I couldn't find any data on that. So we need to explore the possibilities of using the phone and smartphone in learner support. Nevertheless, this raises an issue around the problems of social exclusion. They define social exclusion in the UK as exclusion from the prevailing social systems and its rights and privileges, typically as the results of poverty or the fact of belonging to a minority social group. Well, that's actually an issue that I think we need to maintain, because we cannot allow digital exclusion to continue to the point where we end up with a two-society approach, those people who have access to the internet and can use it, and those who don't. That's already happening in the UK, where in order to get social security now, you actually have to apply online. Well, 20% of people in the UK do not have access to the internet at home. They'll have to go to a library or a social security office and use a computer there, something that they're not familiar with. And I think that there are going to be real problems coming from that direction. Apart from social futures, I think that there are ethical futures. Some while back, I wrote a chapter in a book on ethical practices in distance learning, because it seemed to me that we were perhaps in danger of forgetting some of the ethical issues that should motivate us. Indeed, when I did the research, I found that there wasn't a lot of interest in ethical issues amongst professionals in distance education, and there was considerable concern that the use of IT in distance education might enhance unethical behaviours because of something known as psychological distance. This is certainly happening in the UK in non-educational situations, particularly where young people can send pictures to each other or can harass other people online. And I think if we use these kinds of things in distance education, we will need to be very careful that we maintain an ethical stance. After all, ethics absolutely underlies everything we do. I remember there's a continual contradiction in education of all kinds between a commitment to justice, failing students who must be failed, and a commitment to caring, looking after people who've done that, who've failed. And one of the things that I think is very important in any distance education system is to accept that there will be people who fail, people who drop out, but we still owe them a duty of care. One of the first things I did when I joined the OU was to put together a little leaflet for people who dropped out, which I called Bailing Out. It had a picture of someone in a parachute on the front cover. And my idea was not necessarily to try and get them straight back. It was partly to find out why they'd dropped out, but also to ensure that they knew why they'd dropped out. That may sound a little strange, but sometimes when people drop out, they don't necessarily have a clear set of reasons, and it seemed to me to be very useful for them to understand what had happened. Of course, the leaflet also said you're going to be very welcome to come back when things are easier for you. And we did find, oddly enough, because distance education administrative systems are so complicated, we actually found up to 10% of our dropped out students needn't have dropped out. They'd misunderstood something in the system, and they could actually have been retrieved had we caught them early enough. There's another ethical dilemma in distance education that I think probably affects institutions like the Open University more than here. I think you're much luckier here, and that is the dilemma of recruitment versus retention. If, as you do in the UK, get your income from student tuition fees right up front, then you are under heavy pressure to try and recruit as many students as you can, somewhat regardless of whether those students are really ethically available for distance learning. So there is a huge tension between all the publicity in the OU and, well, I was going to say retention, but there is no information about retention. What there is a huge effort, newspaper adverts, television adverts, and so on, pulling people in, sometimes I think at the risk of what we might call mis-selling. And I think that is something that is going to strike us in a few years' time when some students decide that actually they were recruited unethically. One of my next futures is, I suppose, very simple. It's psychological futures. And what I mean by that is, very simply, is we need to know more about how and why distance students learn. This struck me a few years ago that I'd been working in distance education for many years, and I didn't actually know what made people learn, and more importantly, what kept them learning. I did look around and tried to find a book on learning. I did indeed find a book on learning, but I'm afraid it was far too dense and I dropped out of reading the book at quite an early stage. I couldn't find simple things that actually told me how I might help students to learn from a psychological end. So I'm going to continue to try and find ways of understanding more about how students learn. The other thing future that I think is particularly interesting is, well, it's all about money. What are the financial futures for us? Demand for higher education is hugely increasing internationally. We know that distance education is more economical than conventional education by quite a long way. We know it's more sustainable, which is increasingly important. But of course, only if we manage the problem of dropout rates more effectively. So I'm also focusing my attentions on trying to understand more about the costs and benefits in distance education. And at the moment, I have a number of pages of algebra showing all sorts of things. I think they might show all sorts of things if I actually understood them. I need someone who really knows the whole business of cost and benefit analysis to help me. Surprisingly, though, I find not a lot of interest out there in distance education institutions about the whole business of costs and benefits. I find that quite surprising, given that it's something that drives all of what we do. So if you have an idea about these things, I would say try following the money, as they did at Watergate, because the money will take you to interesting places. There are also political futures, if I can put it that way. Because what's happening in the UK is that the government has decided that it wants much more competition in the university sector. So it's inviting universities, private universities, to come in and set up. What's alarming about this is that the control, the quality control, seems alarmingly thin. Universities, private universities like these, can come in and set up with absolutely minimal monitoring. The idea, of course, is that they will compete in the usual way, and those that don't work will hopefully disappear. Although what will happen to the students who've invested time and money in them isn't so clear. The other problem is that they will make their money from recruitment, not retention. And the other day, there was a list of private universities in the Times Higher Education showing that some of them have substantial dropout rates. And this graph actually shows their dropout rates in blue compared with their benchmark, what their dropout rates should be, in red. And you can see that several of them have much higher dropout rates than they should have, given the kind of students they've got. Whether that issue will be taken on, I don't know. In America, there's something of a scandal going on because private universities are sucking huge amounts of money from the government in student loans, which are not likely to be repaid or not repaid in full. And I notice that occasionally these universities are referred to as failure factories because that's how they operate. Another financial future is one that I find quite curious, but is along similar lines, and that's what's going on in outsourcing. You can now, both in the US and the UK, outsource quite a lot of your activities. So, for instance, you can outsource your student support. You can ask a private company to take over your student support systems. You can also outsource your admissions advice. When I was in Chile a couple of weeks ago, they were using something called Smarter Measure. You just give your incoming student data to Smarter Measure, and they will send back a list of those students who will be vulnerable, but also a detailed list of how they are vulnerable, whether their skills, computer skills are lacking or language skills are lacking, and so on. And you can then, in theory at any rate, focus your attention on these students in a much more coherent kind of way. Many years ago, I was in the US and came across an organization which will actually deal with your retention problem. So-called. This is Ruffaloni, or Ruffaloni Noel Levitz, as it was then. And they will come into your institution and they will say quite straightforwardly, we see you've got a dropout problem. Let us into your system. We will increase your retention. That will increase your student income and we'll take a cut of that increase. I thought this was a little unlikely, but this company has been around now for nearly 20 years in the US, so it must be making money some way. And I'm surprised that it's not moved into the UK. Maybe I should set up a branch myself. Finally, you can also outsource your staff development. For instance, there is a company called Epigeum where you can ask your staff to take courses in student support and various other issues. So there's a lot of this going on. I don't know what the long-term effect of this is. I should have said that you can not only outsource your student support, you can actually buy in a system that your students can actually use for academic support. You simply say to your students, our faculty are too busy doing research. If you've any academic questions, please approach www whatever. I have a feeling that there are some universities in the UK who are really going to love that. My wife works at the University of Warwick, where over the years the university has managed to cut down the amount of time that it spends on teaching. So when a student turns up, they are told, oh well, next week is a reading week and there'll be no lectures. Oh, and by the way, in 2 or 3 weeks' time there'll be a revision week without any lectures. And oh, we are having the exams very early this year, in early May, and there'll be nothing happening after that. I think when I calculated it, they'd actually got their teaching year down to 17 weeks. I find that extraordinary. And my wife, when she meets students, is continually coming across them saying, well, I don't have any lectures this week, so I don't really know what to do. You can be sure she tells them what to do, but they shouldn't really be in that position. Well, those then are just a few of the innovations that I think may be important to reconnoitre, important to keep an eye on to see what is happening out there. And a few weeks ago I was at a conference in London where I was talking with people about innovations, and I thought we really ought to see what they feel, but I didn't want to just take a vote and so on. So I asked them to imagine that they were going to have a bet on a horse race. And the horse race would be a series of innovations. I gave them £100 each, that's virtual pounds, and I asked them to bet on what they thought was going to be the most important innovation coming up. And this was the result. I thought it was quite interesting. I mean, this was a group of 20 to 30 very experienced distance educators, and you can see that actually possibly the most important one was learning more about motivational techniques. Equally, learning analytics was going to be a front runner. Fortunately, emotion detection was a non-starter, and virtual reality and MOOCs were way back in the field. So I rather liked this as a bit of a chance to see what was going on. But you may feel differently. You may very well have different ideas about what the futures are for the Open University of Sri Lanka. And of course, you have to remember, and as an old physicist, I always remember the words of Niels Bohr, the famous Danish physicist, who used to say, "Prediction is very difficult, especially about the future." And sometimes I think, you know, maybe it's all a bit simpler than this, that what you need in the end is just a teacher who cares that you learn, some really good books, and that will take you to graduation in the shortest time. And it's important, isn't it? The writer H.G. Wells, some years ago, said that civilization is in a race between education and catastrophe. Well, it's still a close-run race, colleagues, and you are playing an enormous part in that race here in Sri Lanka. So thank you very much for your time, and thank you very much for all that you're doing here in Sri Lanka. Thank you.
Now we can start our discussion, and any questions from the audience is welcome. And to start the discussion, I just want to focus on MOOCs. And you mentioned that generally less than 7% is the passing rate or graduation rate in that. And if you look at the MOOCs course and the process, how many percentage of learner supports are there in those courses?
They've not found a way of building in learner support effectively, and I should say cost effectively. What the Open University does on its MOOCs is it does use part-time staff to monitor MOOCs and to help people do them. But you have to pay for that somewhere. And if you let people take these MOOCs for free, where does that resource come from? At the moment, I'm not sure. They are trying to monetize MOOCs. In other words, you might have to pay to take a MOOC, or more likely you will have to pay to get any kind of qualification from it. Doesn't seem to be working yet. Maybe it will. But then you're still left with the problem that MOOCs are good for people like you and I, but they're not reaching out. They're not reaching the ordinary person in the street who might benefit.
Normally that there's a ratio 1 to 25 like tutoring and mentoring. So what kind of ratio you find in MOOCs?
Well, the whole point of a MOOC is that they can be massive. In other words, you can get thousands of students taking the same MOOC. Of course, the more massive they get, the less easy it is to put support into the MOOC. That's why I'm still skeptical. I'm sure they will continue. I'm sure we will continue to have MOOCs, and that people like us will find them useful. And that's great. But what really worries me is, for instance, the UKOU has put something of the order of £5 million into its MOOCs. And that's £5 million that ought to be spent on learner support for its actual students. I think it's the fascination with the technology.
Yeah, and the assessments are concerned, more or less, I think they are doing a computer-aided assessment.
Mm-hmm. Yes, they're working on the issue of assessment. It has the same problems, of course, of any online assessment, that you've just no idea who you're assessing. Very tricky. Would I employ, if I were in the position of employing anyone, would I employ someone who only had passed a MOOC? I'm not sure. I think I'd rather have something a little more official. So if my brain surgeon turns out to have studied on a MOOC, I'll leave quickly.
So I just want to ask you about the virtual reality. Virtual reality is I know that is fascinating among the youngsters, and it's growing up. And I can see it in Sri Lanka also. There are people that youngsters are trying to buy and use it for fun purposes and other things, you know. But in education, I mean, whether they have tried and whether is there any material available to use on the virtual reality type of thing, and whether anybody has tried on that particular thing?
Not that I know of yet. Virtual reality sets are still very expensive. A good virtual reality set can still set you back $400 or $500 US. It's not going to be something that students are going to use in the near future. If the price does come down, then will students like the idea of putting on a headset and being in a virtual classroom? I don't know. I think that's quite intriguing. At the moment, the virtual headsets are not very comfortable, and sitting there with a giant headset for an hour or two could be difficult. And people and there are 1 or 2 courses being run on VR, and there was an article some while back on someone who'd watched this course, and they found that they were getting more interested in what the technology was doing, and at the end of the course, they couldn't actually remember what the course had been about. I don't know. I think it's something we have to keep an eye on. Expensive, does need a very high level of broadband. We must watch what they do in South Korea, because if anyone's going to adopt it, it'll be
South Korea.
The Koreans, yeah. So we need to still keep reconnoitering, I think, is the important thing to do.
I mean, the other important part is you mentioned yesterday also about the fully online courses is mostly affecting the entire process and everything. And people are more fond on that particular thing nowadays. Now, to OUSL, I mean, what do you recommend, and what do you think is more suitable?
Well, this is not a technophile message, but my message is stick to your paper correspondence. When I was at the Open Polytechnic in New Zealand, every time we surveyed students, the message would always come back, please keep the correspondence on paper. Now, I guess it's possible as the internet grows that people will get more and more used to studying purely online. Doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence of that yet. And there are downsides. Again, I'm thinking of my wife's experience when she works with students and they're busy on their laptops. What she finds is that they're very easily distracted. They're working away, reading a text, and suddenly an email will pop up with an interesting video of a cat doing something silly. So that's what they watch. I'm sure it will get better. But I think for the moment, if you can use particularly mobile technology for learner support and for proactive contact with students, that's going to be the ideal way to go. But leave the course material on paper. Although from what the students were telling us this morning, we have to work harder at getting to them on time. Which is, of course, a big problem with paper. You don't have with internet delivery. Nevertheless, I would stick with that. I used to have a colleague who said he didn't mind a silent audience as long as they weren't moving towards him.
So if there's no question, thank you very much, Professor Ormond Simpson, for your time. And now Dr. Jayantha will give the vote of thanks.
Yeah.
Our distinguished speaker, Professor Ormond Simpson, our Vice Chancellor, Deputy Vice Chancellor, Professor Rajendra, Director of the International Unit of the Open University of Sri Lanka, all the colleagues here. My responsibility is here, deliver the vote of thanks. I am Dr. Jayantha Wattividanagi, Acting Director of the Center for Education and Technology and Media. So I am really privileged to do this vote of thanks, especially for our distinguished speaker, Professor Ormond Simpson, visiting fellow of London University International Program. Your knowledge, experience in all the continents with different communities of the world over the years, few decades, really expanded our paradigm on this particular subject, learner support and student retention. So on behalf of the Center for Education, Technology and Media and the Director of the IT unit and the staff, in broader terms, Vice Chancellor, and on behalf of the Open University of Sri Lanka, I really thank you for being here, delivering this marvelous lecture, presentation, and the discussion. And also I would like to thank Professor Rajendra, Director of IRU in the Open University of Sri Lanka, taking this huge task to organize this lecture today, and also do various things when you are here. And on top of that, our Vice Chancellor, Professor Ambahan Ariduri, Deputy Vice Chancellor, Professor Kamal Bandar Gunaherat, really supported us to organize this series of lectures, seminars, and especially today's distinguished lecture. And I thank from the CETMe and also on behalf of the IT division for you, sir, your endless support to make this event success. And finally, I thank all my staff at the at the Center for Educational Technology and Media, and also the staff members of the IT division of the Open University of Sri Lanka. Finally, I thank all the members of the staff of the Open University of Sri Lanka being here to participate in this great event. Thank you very much.